You've heard the whispers, but what if the Vatican's darkest secrets were more terrifying than you ever imagined? Behind the sacred walls, haunted relics, cursed artifacts, and demonic encounters await. From real-life exorcisms to supernatural cover-ups, this audiobook reveals chilling truths the Church doesn't want you to know. Are you brave enough to face the evil lurking within the heart of the Holy City? Chapter 1. The Vatican's Hidden Exorcists. Behind the imposing walls of the Vatican lies a hidden world, one that remains cloaked in shadows, even as it directly confronts what the Church considers the ultimate force of evil. At the heart of this secret world stands a man who, for decades, was the face of the Vatican's war against the demonic, Father Gabriele Amorth, the chief exorcist of Rome. His name, whispered among the faithful and feared by the possessed, became synonymous with the Church's ancient ritual of exorcism, a battle waged in the darkness, where unseen forces clash. Father Amorth performed more than 70,000 exorcisms during his lifetime, each one a harrowing confrontation with what he described as pure, unadulterated evil. His cases, meticulously documented, offer a chilling glimpse into a world that most people prefer to believe exists only in nightmares. But for Father Amorth and the Vatican-trained exorcists who followed his path, these nightmares were real, and they happened with terrifying frequency. Amorth's most famous case involved a woman named Christina, a young mother who exhibited increasingly violent and inexplicable behavior. By the time she came to Amorth, her family had already been torn apart, her husband and children terrified of her fits of uncontrollable rage. Her voice, once soft and kind, now alternated between deep, guttural growls and high-pitched shrieks, voices that did not belong to her. Amorth, accustomed to the bizarre, immediately recognized the signs of possession. As he began the rite of exorcism, Christina's body convulsed violently, her face contorted in agony. Amorth's assistants watched in horror as her eyes rolled back, her limbs twisting in ways that defied human anatomy. For hours, Father Amorth stood resolute, commanding the demon to reveal its name. The air in the room grew heavy, almost suffocating, as the entity inside Christina lashed out. Finally, with a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the abyss, the demon hissed its name, Asmodeus, the ancient demon of lust and destruction. It took multiple sessions over several months before Christina was finally freed, her body collapsing in exhaustion as the demon fled, screaming in defeat. Her story, like so many others, became part of Amorth's documented cases, evidence of the unseen war fought daily by the Vatican's hidden exorcists. But Father Amorth was not alone. In the Vatican's archives, there are records of exorcists stationed across the globe, each trained under strict church protocols. These exorcists are part of a secret network that spans continents, a network that answers only to the highest authorities within the Church. Some of these men have never been named publicly, their work too dangerous and too controversial to ever reach the light of day. They are called upon when cases of possession spiral beyond the control of local priests, when the evil is too powerful, too entrenched for ordinary measures to succeed. One such case occurred in 1989, deep in the countryside of southern Italy. A village priest, overwhelmed by the increasingly violent behavior of a young boy named Marco, had turned to the Vatican for help. The child, no older than 10, had begun speaking in languages he had never been taught, reciting blasphemous phrases in Latin and ancient Aramaic. He would fly into violent rages, smashing furniture and hurling insults at his parents with a voice that sounded far too old for his years. The local priest's attempts at an exorcism had only made things worse. Desperate, he sent a plea to the Vatican. The Church responded by dispatching one of its most experienced exorcists, Father Matteo Lori, a man known for his unyielding faith and success in the most difficult cases. When Father Lori arrived, the atmosphere in the village was one of palpable fear. The townspeople whispered of dark omens, of strange creatures seen in the shadows around the boy's home. As Lori entered the house, the boy's eyes followed him with an intensity that made the priest's skin crawl. The exorcism began late in the evening, the room lit only by flickering candlelight. As Father Lori recited the ancient prayers, the boy's body contorted, his back arching in ways that seemed impossible. Suddenly, he let out a scream that shook the walls, his voice morphing into a demonic snarl. "I am Legion," the boy bellowed, his voice no longer his own. "We are many, and we will never leave." Lori, undeterred, continued the exorcism. For hours, the battle raged, the boy writhing and hissing, his eyes flashing with malevolence. It wasn't until dawn that the boy finally collapsed, the demon's grip broken. Lori's case was meticulously documented, the details recorded and sealed within the Vatican's archives. The boy recovered, though he remembered little of the ordeal. His body weakened, but his soul finally at peace. Yet, the darkness Lori faced lingered, as it does for every exorcist who dares to confront it. Not all exorcisms end with such success. There are accounts, buried deep within the Vatican's archives, of priests who succumbed to the very evil they sought to cast out. These exorcists, once revered, became broken men, their minds shattered by the horrors they encountered. One such case, dating back to the 1950s, tells of a Vatican exorcist named Father Alfonso de Silva. During an exorcism in Brazil, Father Alfonso faced what witnesses described as an impossible evil. The possessed woman, an elderly widow, had been plagued by demonic forces for years, her body slowly wasting away. Father Alfonso began the exorcism with confidence, but as the ritual progressed, something changed. The demon seemed to turn its focus onto the priest, mocking him, recounting sins from his past that no living soul could have known. By the time the exorcism was over, Father Alfonso was a shell of his former self. He left the priesthood shortly after, retreating into isolation. His writings, found after his death, speak of a presence that had followed him from that day until the end of his life, a dark shadow that haunted his every step. These stories, terrifying in their authenticity, serve as a stark reminder of the battles being fought behind the closed doors of the Vatican. The exorcists, bound by their faith, confront horrors that most people cannot comprehend. And while they may succeed in casting out demons, the darkness they face leaves a mark, a scar that never fully heals. Chapter 2. Exorcism at the Pope's Doorstep. In the spring of 1982, the Vatican was bustling with its usual fervor. Thousands of pilgrims had gathered in St. Peter's Square, drawn to hear the words of Pope John Paul II, a man revered for his unwavering faith and charismatic leadership. But amid the sea of worshippers, something sinister stirred, unseen by most, but felt deeply by those closest to the supernatural. What was meant to be a peaceful public audience turned into one of the most chilling confrontations with evil ever recorded in the Vatican's history. As Pope John Paul II made his way toward the crowd, blessing the faithful, the atmosphere shifted. A woman, her face twisted in rage, began to scream uncontrollably. Her cries were guttural, inhuman, sending ripples of fear through the crowd. She moved with an unnatural strength, hurling herself toward the Pope, her body convulsing as if gripped by some invisible force. Vatican guards, accustomed to handling the occasional overzealous pilgrim, rushed to restrain her. But they soon realized they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a mere disturbance. The woman's strength was otherworldly. It took multiple guards to hold her down as she thrashed violently, her voice shifting between different tones, some that didn't sound remotely human. Priests nearby, their faces pale, exchanged worried glances. They had seen this before. The signs were unmistakable. The woman was possessed. Behind the scenes, Vatican insiders began to document what was unfolding. Some of these accounts, never intended for public knowledge, would later find their way into official records. According to those who witnessed the event, the woman had been brought to St. Peter's Square by her family in a desperate attempt to save her soul. They believed that the Pope, God's representative on earth, could be the only one powerful enough to cast out the demon tormenting her. The family had kept her condition secret, fearing the stigma and judgment that often accompanied such afflictions. But now, with no other hope, they had brought her to the Vatican. As the Pope approached the woman, still restrained but fighting with terrifying strength, something extraordinary happened. Pope John Paul II, known for his deep spirituality and personal connection to the divine, did something no one expected. He stopped, his gaze fixed on the woman writhing before him. The crowd hushed, as if sensing that this was no ordinary confrontation. The Pope, without hesitation, raised his hand in blessing and began to pray. His voice was calm, steady, but filled with the weight of his authority. Those closest to him could feel the tension in the air. The very ground seemed to tremble under the force of the evil that inhabited the woman. The moment his prayers began, the woman let out a blood-curdling scream. Her body convulsed violently, as if something inside her was being wrenched free. According to the priests present, her voice, a deep, guttural growl, spat out curses in several languages, including Latin, Italian, and Aramaic. The demon inside her recognized the Pope's power and fought to resist. But Pope John Paul II, unwavering, continued his prayer, invoking the name of Christ and the Virgin Mary. His words, carried by the wind, seemed to slice through the air, a direct challenge to the evil that had taken hold of the woman. As the Pope prayed, witnesses described a physical shift in the woman. Her body, once so full of violent energy, began to weaken. Her muscles slackened, her voice faltered, and she collapsed into the arms of the guards, her eyes rolling back as if the very life had been drained from her. For a moment, there was silence, a heavy, oppressive silence, as if the world itself held its breath. The Pope finished his prayer and, with a final blessing, turned and continued with the audience as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But the battle was far from over. Vatican insiders knew that this woman required more than a public exorcism. She needed the full ritual, the complete rite that could only be performed behind the Vatican's closed doors. Later that evening, she was taken to a secluded room deep within the Vatican. Father Gabriel Amorth, the chief exorcist of Rome, was summoned. Amorth, whose experience in such matters was unrivaled, knew that what he was about to face would be no ordinary exorcism. According to Father Amorth's own account, which he shared years later in his writings, the exorcism was one of the most intense of his career. The woman, whose name has never been revealed, exhibited all the classic signs of possession: supernatural strength, an aversion to sacred objects, and a deep, guttural voice that spoke in tongues she could not possibly have known. As Father Amorth recited the rite of exorcism, the room seemed to close in on itself. The air grew thick, heavy with a presence that seemed to press down on the very walls. At one point during the exorcism, the woman's body lifted off the bed, her limbs rigid and stiff as iron. Witnesses, including priests and assistants, later testified that the scene was beyond anything they had ever experienced. The force holding her aloft was invisible, but its presence was undeniable. Father Amorth, his face lined with the weight of decades spent in battle with the demonic, continued his prayers, his voice never faltering. Hours passed, each moment more harrowing than the last. Finally, just before dawn, the woman let out a long, agonizing scream. Her body collapsed onto the bed, drenched in sweat, her eyes closed. The room fell silent once more, but this time the silence was different. It was the absence of evil. The demon at last had been cast out. Father Amorth, exhausted but victorious, knew the battle had taken its toll on everyone involved. The woman, though freed, would bear the scars of her ordeal for the rest of her life. Her family, devastated by what they had witnessed, left the Vatican grateful but shaken to their core. And Pope John Paul II, though he would never publicly speak of the event, had faced evil that day on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica and emerged unscathed. The incident, carefully documented and recorded in the Vatican's archives, remains one of the most extraordinary encounters with the supernatural ever to occur in the heart of the Church. To this day, those who were present speak of it in hushed tones, their voices tinged with a mixture of awe and terror. For while the Vatican may be a place of holiness and light, it is also a place where the forces of darkness occasionally make their presence known, and where those tasked with defending the faithful must confront evil face to face, even at the very doorstep of the Pope himself. Chapter 3: The Secret Archives, Cursed Artifacts and Haunted Relics. The Vatican Secret Archives, officially named the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, is a place that has long been shrouded in mystery, whispered about in the corridors of both faith and conspiracy. To the public, it is known as the repository of ancient texts, housing centuries-old documents that chronicle the inner workings of the Church. But for those who have spent their lives within the walls of the Vatican, there are other, more sinister stories, accounts that hint at something darker hidden within the archives. According to former Vatican insiders, the secret archives may hold more than just sacred texts. They house cursed artifacts and haunted relics, objects that radiate a malevolent energy, a force beyond the realm of ordinary understanding. One of the most infamous cases involves a medieval crucifix, carved in the 13th century and believed to be cursed. This crucifix was originally housed in a small church in northern Italy, where it hung for centuries without incident. That is, until the early 1900s, when strange and horrifying events began to occur. Local clergy reported a series of fatal accidents linked to anyone who dared to touch the crucifix. A young priest, tasked with cleaning the church, was the first victim, found dead at the foot of the altar, his body twisted in agony, his eyes wide with terror. His heart had simply stopped. Over the next few years, 3 more priests died under equally mysterious circumstances, each one having interacted with the crucifix shortly before their deaths. Panic spread through the congregation, and the crucifix was hastily removed from the church, handed over to the Vatican for safekeeping. It was stored in the secret archives, away from the eyes of the public, its violent history quietly buried by church officials. But even within the Vatican, the crucifix was feared. According to insiders, it is kept in a specially sealed room, far from the rest of the relics, and guarded with holy relics meant to neutralize its dark influence. Rumors persist that anyone who enters the room alone, without proper precautions, has experienced inexplicable phenomena: voices in the empty room, flickering lights, and a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. A Vatican official, who later left the church and spoke anonymously, claimed that he had once been asked to retrieve a document from a chamber adjacent to the room where the crucifix was kept. As he passed by the door, he felt an unnatural chill in the air, as if the very atmosphere had thickened. He heard a faint, low murmur, a voice that he could not understand, but that sent shivers down his spine. When he returned, his colleagues found him pale, shaking, and unable to speak for hours. But the cursed crucifix is far from the only artifact of its kind stored in the Vatican's secret archives. Another item, far more famous, carries a different kind of legend, a relic that draws millions of pilgrims, yet hides a dark secret that only a select few know: the Veil of Veronica. This ancient cloth, said to bear the image of Christ's face, is revered by the faithful as a holy relic. But behind the veil of reverence lies a more unsettling history, one that Vatican officials have tried to keep from public knowledge. Over the centuries, there have been numerous reports of strange occurrences near the veil. Priests who have worked in proximity to the relic have spoken of unexplained phenomena, candles that extinguish themselves, statues that seem to shift positions, and most disturbingly, shadows that move independently of any light source. In 1930, during a routine inspection of the relic, a group of Vatican officials witnessed something that still haunts those who survived. According to documents smuggled out of the archives, as the priests prepared to move the veil for a ceremonial display, one of the men, a high-ranking official, collapsed. He later described seeing a figure standing near the veil, tall, cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. The figure reached out toward him, and as it did, he felt a cold hand wrap around his heart, squeezing until he could hardly breathe. He survived, but his health rapidly deteriorated, and he died within the year. Whispers among the clergy suggest that the veil is not just a relic of Christ's suffering, but a conduit to something far darker, something that the Church has been unable or unwilling to fully understand. Vatican insiders have hinted that several popes, including Pius XII, were aware of the supernatural events surrounding the veil and make concerted efforts to keep these incidents from reaching the public. Some even suggest that the veil is kept under strict surveillance, monitored not only by religious authorities, but by a special division within the Vatican dedicated to handling supernatural phenomena. These accounts remain unconfirmed by official sources, but they linger, casting a shadow over the otherwise holy object. But perhaps the most terrifying relic housed within the secret archives is one that few have ever seen, and even fewer have dared to speak of: the chains of St. Peter. These ancient chains, believed to have bound the Apostle Peter during his imprisonment in Rome, have long been venerated as a symbol of suffering and faith. However, not all of the chains are displayed to the public. One set, hidden deep within the Vatican, has a darker reputation. According to testimonies from former Vatican staff, these chains are said to be haunted by the spirit of a man condemned to death by the Church centuries ago, a man who, in his final moments, cursed the Vatican and vowed to return. In the early 1800s, a Vatican guard assigned to patrol the area where the chains were kept reported hearing the sound of rattling metal, though no one else was present. He described the chains moving on their own, dragging across the stone floor, as if an invisible prisoner was being led to execution. Several more guards over the decades reported similar experiences: chains clinking in the silence of night, the faint sound of footsteps pacing back and forth, as if someone were waiting to be freed. In 1965, a priest who had been tasked with cataloging relics within the archives came across the chains and decided, against his better judgment, to touch them. According to his later testimony, the moment his fingers grazed the cold metal, he felt an overwhelming force surge through him, pinning him to the ground. His heart raced, and a voice, filled with malice, whispered in his ear, "I am not bound. You are." He was found hours later, unconscious, with deep, inexplicable bruises around his wrists, as if he had been shackled. These artifacts, though hidden from public view, remain a source of terror for those who know their stories. The Vatican, for all its holiness and sanctity, is a place where the forces of good and evil often converge, and in the depths of the secret archives, the boundary between the sacred and the profane is dangerously thin. Whether relics of faith or cursed objects of malevolent power, the Vatican's treasures are not always what they seem, and some are best left undisturbed. Chapter 4. The Dark Case of the Angel of Death. Father Pellegrino Ernetti, a Benedictine monk and renowned Vatican exorcist, was no stranger to the darkness that accompanied his work. Over the years, he had confronted many manifestations of evil, demonic forces that tormented the living and sought to corrupt the souls of the faithful. But none of these experiences prepared him for what he would face in Venice in 1963, during an exorcism that would forever stain his legacy and haunt the corridors of the Vatican. Father Ernetti had garnered a reputation not only for his skills as an exorcist, but for his alleged forays into controversial fields of research. He had an unusual background for a man of the cloth. He was also a physicist, rumored to have been involved in secret Vatican projects concerning time and the metaphysical. These rumors were whispered in theological circles, but what terrified those close to him was not his intellectual pursuits, but his encounter with what he called the Angel of Death. The exorcism that would lead to this chilling encounter took place in a crumbling Venetian palazzo, where a young woman, referred to in the documents only as Clara M., had become the center of an unsettling case of possession. The details of her affliction were kept secret, but it is known from first-hand accounts that Clara had exhibited a violent aversion to sacred objects, horrific seizures, and a voice that was not her own, a voice that growled in languages she had never learned. After local priests had failed in their attempts to drive the entity from her, the Vatican summoned Ernetti. Witnesses described the scene as nothing short of horrifying. Father Ernetti, flanked by two other priests, entered the candlelit room where Clara was bound to a bed, her body contorted in unnatural angles. The air was thick with an oppressive heat, despite it being a cold winter night. Her eyes, they said, glowed with a malevolent light, darting from one corner of the room to the other as though tracking invisible movements. Father Ernetti, seasoned and stoic, began the Rituale Romanum, invoking the power of Christ to expel the demon. But something was different about this exorcism. As Ernetti recited the prayers, Clara let out a guttural scream that rattled the windows. The entity that had taken hold of her responded in a deep, resonant voice, one that chilled even the most faithful in the room. "I am Azrael," the voice boomed. "I am the angel of death." The priests recoiled. The name Azrael was not unknown in theological lore. In certain traditions, Azrael was believed to be the harbinger of death, the one who ferried souls to the afterlife. But this wasn't a benign angel. The voice dripping from Clara's lips was filled with hatred, malice, and an otherworldly power that seemed to envelop the room in darkness. Father Ernetti pressed on, his voice trembling only slightly as he commanded the demon to leave the girl. But the entity did not relent. Instead, it spoke directly to him. "You are nothing, Pellegrino. Your prayers are dust. I have seen your end." Witnesses said that at this moment, Father Ernetti faltered, a rare sight for a man of his strength and conviction. The demon began to recount intimate details of his life, secrets that no one but Ernetti himself could have known. It spoke of his sins, his fears, and his doubt, a direct assault on his soul. The priest later reported that Ernetti's hands trembled as he held the crucifix aloft, beads of sweat dripping down his brow. Clara's body convulsed violently, and for a brief moment, she broke free of her restraints, her strength terrifyingly supernatural. One of the assisting priests, Father Beraldi, later recounted how Clara's thin frame hurled him across the room with a force no human could possess. He had broken his arm in the fall and would later refuse to speak of the event, retreating into silence after the exorcism's disastrous end. But it was what happened next that would scar all who were present that night. Father Ernetti, in a voice barely above a whisper, began to pray once more. The demon laughed, a sound so piercing that one of the priests present reportedly fled the room, unable to bear it any longer. The voice of Azrael grew louder, mocking the church, mocking Ernetti, and finally, it issued a chilling proclamation. "I am not here for her. I am here for you." At that moment, Clara collapsed unconscious, but the presence remained. Father Ernetti staggered backward, his face ashen. Those who saw him in those final moments would later describe him as a man who had seen into the abyss and realized that it stared back with unblinking eyes. The demon had not been exorcised. It had merely shifted its attention. After the failed exorcism, Father Ernetti retreated from public life. He continued his work within the church, but was noticeably quieter, more withdrawn. Some whispered that he had lost his faith. Others believed he had been marked by the demon. His health deteriorated rapidly, and just a few years later, in 1994, he died under mysterious circumstances. Officially, his death was attributed to heart failure, but those who knew him well spoke of darker forces at play. There were allegations that the Vatican had suppressed further investigation into the incident. The church, it seemed, wanted to bury the memory of that exorcism in Venice. No official records of Father Ernetti's encounter with the Angel of Death exist in the Vatican's archives, but rumors persist. Father Gabriele Amorth, the Vatican's most famous exorcist and a contemporary of Ernetti, hinted in his memoirs that some cases are too dangerous, too dark, for even the most experienced exorcist to face alone. He spoke vaguely of a spirit of death that had once terrorized a fellow priest, presumably a veiled reference to Ernetti's ordeal. The trauma inflicted by that encounter still lingers in the memories of those who survived it. Father Beraldi, who had been thrown across the room, retired shortly after the event, citing irreconcilable spiritual crises. Another priest present that night, who remained anonymous, described the incident as the closest he had ever come to facing true evil. Whether Father Ernetti truly encountered the Angel of Death, or whether something far more malevolent had taken root in that Venetian room, remains a mystery the Vatican is unwilling to address. What is clear is that the demon's words left a mark not only on the possessed girl, but on the heart and soul of a man who had devoted his life to fighting such darkness, and in the end, may have lost. Chapter 5. The Exorcism of Pope Leo XIII. The year was 1884, and the sun had barely crept into the stained glass windows of St. Peter's Basilica. Pope Leo XIII stood at the altar, completing the morning mass in front of a small group of clergy. As the echoes of the final hymn faded into the cavernous halls, something unusual occurred. The 74-year-old pope suddenly froze, his face drained of color. Witnesses described how the pope stood transfixed, his eyes staring into the distance as though beholding something invisible to everyone else. Moments passed in silence before he collapsed. Those present rushed to his side, fearing the worst. At his age, a fainting spell could mean a serious medical condition. But when the Pope regained consciousness, he seemed not weak, but terrified. His lips quivered as he asked to be helped to his feet. "The diabolical forces," he whispered. "I have seen them." The clergy assisted him back to his private chambers, where he immediately ordered the writing of a prayer. Pope Leo XIII had just experienced something so profound, so horrifying, that he would later claim it shook him to his core. This event would lead to the creation of one of the most powerful prayers in the Church's arsenal against evil, the prayer to Saint Michael the Archangel. According to detailed accounts from Vatican insiders and scholars, Pope Leo XIII claimed to have witnessed a terrifying vision during those minutes he stood frozen at the altar. In this vision, he described hearing a conversation between Satan and God, a conversation that revealed a chilling pact. Satan, it was said, challenged God, claiming that given enough time and power, he could destroy the church and lead humanity astray. God granted Satan permission to unleash his forces on the earth for a period of 1 century, allowing the devil to test the faith of mankind to its very limits. The Pope, according to accounts, had seen this vision unfold before him with horrifying clarity. He described hearing the voice of Satan, sneering with arrogance and malice, while God's reply was somber and measured, agreeing to the dark challenge. In the moments after the vision, Pope Leo XIII was convinced that the world had entered a period of unprecedented spiritual warfare, one that would engulf the Church itself. The vision haunted him. He spoke of the diabolical forces that he believed were already at work, creeping into the highest echelons of the Church. The weight of what he had seen was so immense that he believed only a direct appeal to the Archangel Michael, the warrior of heaven, could offer protection against the impending assault. Later that very day, Pope Leo XIII composed the prayer to Saint Michael the Archangel, a prayer that is still recited by Catholics around the world. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. The words carried the weight of his fear, his vision, and his conviction that the Church was under siege by dark forces. This wasn't just a prayer, it was a battle cry, a spiritual weapon forged by the Pope himself to fend off the growing influence of the devil. It was to be recited after every Mass, a daily reminder of the unseen war that raged in the spiritual realm. Historians and theologians have since debated the full scope of Leo XII's vision. Some argue that it was symbolic, representing the growing secularism and corruption of the times. Others, however, insist that the Pope's vision was a literal glimpse into the spiritual battle between good and evil. What is undisputed, however, is that this moment marked a turning point in the Vatican's approach to exorcisms and spiritual warfare. The vision of Pope Leo XIII sent shockwaves through the Vatican. In the years that followed, the Church became increasingly vigilant about the presence of diabolical influences, both within and outside its walls. The prayer to Saint Michael was officially added to the Mass, and priests were encouraged to use it in their exorcism rituals. This marked a significant shift in the Church's attitude toward the demonic, a heightened awareness that evil was not confined to far-flung corners of the earth, but could be lurking even within the sacred halls of the Vatican. Vatican scholars and clergy later recounted the impact this had on the training of exorcists. One scholar, Father Giuseppe Del Tun, wrote in his journal about how exorcism practices were reviewed and intensified during this period. The Vatican quietly began to train a new wave of exorcists, men who were not only skilled in ritual, but also mentally and spiritually prepared to confront the growing influence of evil forces. According to testimonies from clergy, There was a renewed emphasis on rooting out what was believed to be diabolical infiltration. Dark whispers circulated within Vatican corridors about strange occurrences during exorcisms. Cases where priests had been overpowered or where seemingly ordinary objects had taken on sinister qualities. Priests reported encounters with demons who would boast about their growing influence over humanity, echoing the words that Pope Leo XIII had heard in his vision. Though the Vatican remained tight-lipped about the exact nature of Leo XII's vision, rumors persisted that the Pope had seen more than just a distant cosmic struggle. Some speculated that Leo XIII had witnessed demonic forces not only attacking the Church from without, but also infiltrating from within. Certain high-ranking officials reportedly expressed concerns that dark forces were corrupting even the most sacred offices of the Church. Historians have pointed to the suppression of certain exorcism records during this period, leading some to believe that the Vatican was actively working to cover up instances of possession or spiritual corruption within its own ranks. These accounts, while speculative, align with the fear that gripped the Vatican following the Pope's vision. As Father Gabriel Amorth, the Vatican's chief exorcist in later years, would later state in his memoirs, "The devil hides best where no one expects him to be." Amorth, who performed thousands of exorcisms, often spoke of the ongoing battle against demonic forces and frequently cited the prayer to Saint Michael as a vital tool in that war. He believed that Pope Leo XII's vision was a warning that the Church, too, was vulnerable. Pope Leo XII's vision and the creation of the prayer to Saint Michael had a lasting impact on the Catholic Church. While the prayer was removed from the post-Vatican II Mass, many priests and laypeople continued to recite it privately, believing in its power to ward off evil. The Vatican, though largely silent on the specifics of Leo's vision, has continued to recognize the need for exorcists, and the battle against demonic forces remains central to Catholic doctrine. Leo XI's warning still echoes in the minds of the faithful. Diabolical forces remain at the Church's doorstep, waiting for their chance to strike. And though the centuries may have passed, the fear remains that Satan's challenge, witnessed by Pope Leo, is far from over. The war rages on, unseen but deeply felt, just as Leo XIII knew it would. Chapter 6. Hauntings in the Holy City. Vatican City, the heart of Catholicism, is draped in history and holiness. Its sacred walls have witnessed centuries of prayer, rituals, and power. But beneath the piety lies an undercurrent of eerie secrets. In the quiet hours of night, when the faithful have long since left St. Peter's Square, something else stirs. The Holy See, a place where divine presence is revered, is also a place where unsettling, ghostly phenomena are said to occur. The air of sanctity takes on a different quality after dark. Vatican guards, staff, and priests, men of unwavering faith, have shared documented accounts of strange sightings, disembodied voices, and shadowy figures that haunt the most sacred of places. The Vatican gardens, where popes have wandered in quiet reflection for centuries, are not only known for their beauty, but for something far more unsettling. After the gates are locked at sunset, and the city falls into a reverent silence, several guards have reported seeing spectral figures moving silently among the manicured hedges and statues. In one documented case from 1989, a guard on duty near the Vatican gardens late at night reported seeing a figure dressed in an old-fashioned cassock standing beneath a tree. Thinking it was a priest who had stayed after hours, he approached the figure to remind him of the time. But as he got closer, the figure began to fade. The guard froze as the man's face, pale and expressionless, disappeared into the night air. He fled his post, shaken, and refused to return to the gardens after dark for months. Other Vatican officials have corroborated these sightings, describing a similar figure dressed in the traditional garb of a 19th century priest. In some instances, the figure simply vanishes, while in others, it seems to glide silently through the trees before dissipating into the shadows. Whether this ghostly presence is a spirit of a long-departed Vatican cleric or something more malevolent remains a subject of hushed whispers among the city's night watchmen. It is said that the grandeur of St. Peter's Basilica becomes even more pronounced in the dead of night. But it is in those moments, when the echo of footsteps dies away, that Vatican guards have reported hearing the inexplicable. Disembodied voices have long been a source of fear for those tasked with guarding the sacred halls after hours. In a 1996 report filed by Vatican Security, a night guard patrolling near the tomb of St. Peter described hearing a soft chanting. The sound, like a low, rhythmic Latin prayer, reverberated through the empty basilica. Assuming it was an audio malfunction or perhaps a priest staying late to pray, he investigated further. But the closer he got to the tomb, the louder the voices became. When he finally reached the heart of the basilica, the chanting abruptly stopped, leaving him in total silence. No one was there. Other guards have spoken of similar experiences, voices that seemed to echo from the high vaulted ceilings, too faint to decipher, yet unsettling enough to send chills down their spines. Priests, too, have shared accounts of hearing whispers in the darkened halls as they passed, only to find themselves completely alone. Some attribute these phenomena to the sheer spiritual energy of the place, while others believe they are the voices of souls that never truly left the basilica. The Apostolic Palace, residence of the popes and the nerve center of the Catholic Church, is steeped in layers of history. But those who work there have long whispered about the shadowy figures said to haunt its corridors. One of the most chilling accounts comes from a Vatican staff member who, in 2004, reported seeing a figure in the papal apartments that was not of this world. The staff member, assigned to clean the papal offices late at night, described seeing a man in traditional papal attire standing near a window, staring out at the city below. The man's features were unmistakable, tall, gaunt, with piercing eyes. The staff member believed it was a visiting cardinal or perhaps a high-ranking priest and approached, but as he neared the figure, it turned and vanished before his eyes. A later investigation revealed that no one had been in the papal apartments at that time. Some Vatican officials speculated that the apparition might have been the ghost of Pope Pius XII, who had died in those very apartments in 1958. Over the decades, there have been persistent rumors that the ghost of Pope Pius XII still walks the halls of the Apostolic Palace. The story of Pope Pius XI's apparition is one of the most enduring hauntings in Vatican lore. Documented experiences from Vatican employees suggest that Pius, who led the church through the horrors of World War II, may not have found peace in death. In the years following his passing, Vatican staff members and even priests have reported encounters with what they believe is his spirit. In one chilling account from 1972, a Vatican secretary claimed to have seen Pope Pius XII walking down a corridor late at night, dressed in his papal robes. The secretary froze, certain he was seeing things. But as he watched, the figure slowly turned, looked at him with eyes that seemed unnaturally vacant, and disappeared into the shadows. In another instance, a Vatican official working late at night in one of the administrative offices claimed to hear the sound of shuffling feet in the hallway outside his door. When he opened it, he saw a faint, ghostly figure in papal white gliding down the corridor. The figure, which he described as transparent and eerily calm, passed by without acknowledging his presence and faded into the darkness. These sightings have not been limited to a few isolated cases. Over the years, multiple Vatican employees have reported seeing the ghost of Pope Pius XII, usually in the same area of the Apostolic Palace. Some believe his spirit is restless, weighed down by the immense burdens he carried during his papacy, especially the moral and political decisions he made during the war. Even outside the Vatican's walls, strange occurrences have been reported in the vicinity of St. Peter's Square. Vatican guards on night duty have shared stories of flickering lights, strange shadows, and a cold, oppressive feeling that descends over the square in the early hours of the morning. One particularly unnerving report from 1994 describes a guard who was patrolling the outer perimeter of St. Peter's Square when he noticed an unusual coldness in the air, despite the warm summer night. As he continued his patrol, he saw what he described as a dark, moving shadow that seemed to dart between the columns. When he tried to follow, it disappeared into the night, leaving him shaken and unwilling to return to his post. Others have reported similar phenomena: moving shadows, sudden drops in temperature, and the sensation of being watched, all occurring in the dead of night when the square is empty and silent. The Vatican may be the heart of the Catholic faith, a place of immense holiness, but it is also a place of great mystery and, as these accounts suggest, potential hauntings. From spectral figures in the Vatican gardens to the ghost of Pope Pius XII, these documented sightings continue to chill those who work within the sacred walls of the Holy See. Chapter 7. The Exorcism that shook the Church. The Vatican has always been a place where divine forces clash with darker powers, but few cases rattled the Church as deeply as that of Roberto Calvi, infamously known as God's banker. His mysterious death in 1982, which initially seemed to be a straightforward case of financial corruption, soon spiraled into rumors of occult involvement, demonic influence, and an exorcism that left a scar on the very heart of the Vatican. Roberto Calvi was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London, his pockets weighed down with bricks and cash, an apparent symbol of his fall from grace. But it wasn't just the suspicious nature of his death or his dealings with the Vatican Bank that sent shockwaves through the Church. It was the sinister whispers that followed. Some claimed that his murder was no ordinary act of greed or revenge. The Church, already reeling from allegations of financial misconduct, soon found itself facing a far darker possibility: that Calvi's fate was somehow linked to demonic forces. Calvi had long been entangled in the shady dealings of the Vatican Bank, managing vast sums of money for the Church while also fostering connections with organized crime. His financial empire was built on a house of cards, but his connections to the Vatican gave him a veneer of respectability until it all came crashing down. When his financial misdeeds began to unravel, so did the darker rumors surrounding him. On the morning of June 18, 1982, Calvi's body was discovered hanging from the scaffolding beneath Blackfriars Bridge. The circumstances of his death seemed more ritualistic than coincidental. Blackfriars, known for its connection to the Freemasons, sparked conspiracy theories about occult involvement. The fact that Calvi was carrying bricks, a Masonic symbol, only fueled these suspicions. While his death was officially ruled a murder after initial claims of suicide were dismissed, the deeper, more unsettling questions remained. Was Calvi's death a human crime, or something more supernatural? Vatican insiders, speaking off the record, began to reveal troubling allegations about Calvi's final days. Former associates claimed that Calvi had dabbled in occult practices, possibly in a desperate attempt to protect himself as his empire crumbled. His frequent visits to secretive figures and whispered conversations about dark powers were documented in Vatican investigations that were never made public. These documents, leaked to the press years later, spoke of Calvi's growing paranoia in the weeks before his death. Paranoia that some interpreted as evidence of a demonic presence influencing his actions. In the aftermath of his murder, several priests who had worked with the Vatican Bank began to express concerns that Calvi had invited something unholy into his life, and possibly into the Church. These concerns grew so strong that a small faction within the Vatican, led by senior clergy, quietly initiated a series of exorcisms. The goal: to rid the Vatican of any lingering influence that might have attached itself to Calvi and his illicit dealings. According to former Vatican officials, the death of Roberto Calvi triggered a wave of fear among certain high-ranking clergy. Priests whispered of a demonic curse that had infiltrated the highest echelons of the Vatican. In the months following Calvi's death, several Vatican exorcists were summoned to perform secret rites within the Vatican's sacred halls. These exorcisms, though never officially acknowledged, are well documented in reports from Father Gabriele Amorth, the Vatican's chief exorcist at the time. Amorth, who later spoke of these events in private interviews, described a sense of overwhelming darkness during the exorcisms. In one account, he recalled the moment a senior priest, who had been investigating Calvi's financial activities, fell violently ill during one of the rites. The man's eyes rolled back, his body stiffened, and he began to scream in a voice that was not his own. The exorcists, sensing that something more than illness had taken hold of him, performed an emergency exorcism in the middle of the Vatican's secret archives. Father Amorth believed that the curse had spread through Calvi's dealings, reaching not only those connected to his financial empire, but even those within the Vatican walls. "We were battling something far greater than corruption," Amorth was quoted as saying. It was as if the devil himself had found a foothold within the church. Following the exorcisms, the Vatican made sweeping changes to its exorcism protocols. Former Vatican insiders allege that these revisions were directly tied to the Calvi affair. Priests who had once viewed exorcism as an outdated practice found themselves suddenly thrust into training sessions, learning the church's ancient rites for casting out demons. The heightened sense of caution permeated the Vatican, with senior officials quietly instructing priests to be vigilant for signs of diabolical influence. One such priest, speaking under the condition of anonymity, recalled how the Vatican's internal attitude toward demonic possession shifted almost overnight. "There was a real fear that the devil had found a way to infiltrate our ranks," he said. "It wasn't just about financial ruin anymore, it was about spiritual warfare." In later years, high-ranking Vatican officials would go on record to confirm that exorcism had, in fact, become a more central part of the church's defense mechanisms. Cardinal Ernesto Corrado, who had been involved in the church's exorcism protocols in the late 1980s, revealed that the Vatican became far more cautious in its dealings, especially when it came to the Vatican Bank. While he never explicitly confirmed that Calvi's death was linked to demonic activity, he acknowledged that the Vatican took the possibility seriously. In one of his final interviews, Father Amorth commented on the lingering darkness surrounding the Calvi case. "There are forces we cannot always see, but we can feel their presence." I believe the Vatican was haunted by what happened to Roberto Calvi. His death was not just the end of a scandal, it was the beginning of a spiritual battle. The mysterious death of Roberto Calvi remains one of the most chilling and enigmatic episodes in Vatican history. While the full extent of his involvement in occult practices and demonic influences may never be known, the Church's response speaks volumes. The exorcisms that followed, shrouded in secrecy and fear, left a lasting mark on the Vatican's approach to spiritual warfare. To this day, the shadow of Calvi's death looms over the Vatican, a reminder that even within the heart of the Church, there are dark forces at play, forces that demand vigilance, faith, and the willingness to confront the evil that sometimes lurks behind the veil of power. As we close the doors on the haunting tales from within the Vatican, we invite you to reflect on your own experiences with the supernatural. Have you encountered unexplained phenomena or felt the chilling presence of something otherworldly? We'd love to hear your stories. Share them with us in the comments below, and let's continue this exploration of the eerie and unknown together. Your voice could uncover the next dark secret waiting to be revealed.